Welcome back. Thanks for joining us for Module 4 of Entry Point Basic Training, Module 4, where we address assessment, best practices for conducting the assessment according to our philosophical and value mandates and in a way that is culturally competent. Also, some pointers on identifying and serving transition age youth and those who are surviving or escaping domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, or so on. And then we'll take a quick look at the phased assessment process and timeline. So this is an introduction to the concept of assessment and how we do assessment in Entry Point as a team. Then in modules later on, starting at module 7, you'll see the actual assessment forms, the phased assessment forms, and you learn about how each one of those steps of the assessment process will work. So let's get started with module 4. Again, we're going to talk about what assessment is and CE best practices for engaging with assessment, including how we do trauma-informed care, cultural competency, and engaging the special populations we named, and looking a little bit at the process for assessment, the phased assessment documents. So we just in module 3 learned about access, and now module 4 is looking at assessment. If you're looking at the overall flyover of what the process is, the housing and referral process for Entry Point, then you can see the map of where you are at in this process if you are talking about the things that we are talking about in this module. So we're talking about the phased assessment more later on, but right now just about how we do assessment. Bingo, we're at assessment. So the definition of assessment is the process of documenting participant needs and strengths, identifying barriers to housing, and clarifying a participant's preferences and goals. So it's how we find out what someone needs and what we need to know about them in order to help meet those needs. That's what assessment is for the purposes of Entry Point. So the main thing that we're trying to accomplish is to determine what someone's needs are, what their vulnerabilities are, their struggles and challenges and so on, and particularly what their barriers are to getting and staying housed, what their preferences are about that housing, and the kinds of strengths and assets that offset their vulnerabilities and the challenges, and that we can sort of build on and employ to help us get and keep them housed. So we're using all of this information that we gather over the course of all the parts of the phased assessment to understand what someone's service and housing needs are, and to figure out a strategy to resolve the client's housing crisis. Basically, to make our housing plan for that client or that household. So now we're going to look at some of the best practices we have for conducting assessments in coordinated entry. This will remind you of some of the key frameworks we talked about in Module 2, but this part helps us figure out how to specifically apply those frameworks to the tasks and process of our assessment. We know that consistent and efficient assessment is really critical for making our centralized referral process work. But always the client's needs are our highest priority. What matters more to us than any particular form or process is that we're doing assessments that are trauma-informed, that are culturally competent, and that are developmentally and culturally competent with families, children, and youth. So we have all kinds of solutions and workarounds and problem solving that we can do if you're working with a client or a household who cannot complete the assessment or if results in any part of the assessment, especially part 4, seem to be inaccurate or inadequate to capture what their needs and challenges are. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those workarounds or solutions might be in this module, but we encourage you to partner with us at every step of the way and let us help you. Help us help you navigate whatever challenges come up. So our first framework that we want to apply to assessments is trauma-informed care. What are the principles and strategies that trauma-informed care gives us while we're doing assessment? The first thing is that we want to provide for a client's basic needs first. We want to make sure that they have been fed or as comfortable as possible, have had a chance to use the bathroom, they feel safe and have the privacy that they need and all of those basic needs. This is our chance to provide hospitality, to start that relationship building, to put someone at ease. They are our guest, more importantly than their being our client. And this is our chance to take care of them and help them feel well and sturdy before we start asking them a whole bunch of questions. Part of trauma-informed care also mandates that we give people the rationale for the assessment as a whole. For each part of the assessment, we want to explain to them, why am I asking you these questions? What am I going to do with this information? And on, as an overarching thing, we can explain that we're collecting this info to help serve them well as to demonstrate to the people who fund our work that these services are necessary in the world and that they apply specifically to this client who we're trying to get the services for. So other ways that we employ trauma-informed care are that we want to be proactive about making safe space before and during the assessment. And that includes, and we're actually going to talk about, in the next slide, talk about some extrapolations of each of those. We want to stay attuned to the client's signals of if they're feeling weary, if they're feeling sensitive, if we've sort of touched on a sore spot for them and so on. We want to use basic motivational interviewing skills. If you don't know about motivational interviewing, check it out. It's the most magical and amazing toolbox skill set for helping all of us humans when we're confused or overwhelmed or ambivalent about a thing. Some of the motivational interviewing skills we might use are active or reflective listening, using open-ended questions like, how's your day going? Is there anything I can work on with you or help you with? Things like that. And summarizing. So today we talked about fill in the blank, right? We want to use the language the client uses and don't argue with them about terminology, definitions, or project labels on them or so on. We want to balance efficiency with patience and explain the limits of, as well as the assurances of privacy and confidentiality. How does information sharing work? They get to choose, and we'll explain that to them as we go. We don't want to push them to disclose scary, distressing, painful details about their past. Most of the stuff we're asking people about is really tender and fraught, and we want to be super sensitive to that. And assessment is the best first opportunity to identify and name and celebrate strengths, to declare resilience, to name that for someone and point it out to them. If I'm telling you about all the terrible things that have happened in my life and about all the crisis that I'm in right now, that's a really important moment to point out all of the strengths and assets that I'm bringing to this particular life experience, all the ways that I am tough enough to make it through this. So a few particulars about that. How do we make safe space before and during the assessment? Part of that involves what I call setting up escape routes. Escape routes for sort of physical or emotional safety for the client. That might include saying things like, you don't have to answer any questions that make you uncomfortable. We can take breaks if you like. We can stop at any time you want. we can come back to this later, or never, if it never feels safe or comfortable for you to do this. Some of the limits of confidentiality include that we are mandated reporters, and we'll talk more about that at some other point. But also, we would like for people to share their information or allow us to share their information as a way that we can find housing and services for them and things like that. We'll talk more about that as we go later on. If people want to share, then we listen to all the details they care to share. We're generous with our presence and our attention, but if people are not trying to disclose or share scary or painful details, or really any details, we don't probe for more information than a client wants to readily provide. Lots of the questions we ask can be answered quite briefly and simply without lots of details. Again, we want to stay attuned to the client's signals. We can encourage them to use grounding and coping techniques or model those for them. Things like, wow, this is stressful stuff. Let's just take a deep breath together. Or things like, would you like to take a break, get a sip of water? Would you like to take a, take a walk or do something else for a while and come back to this later? Basically, offering to let them do whatever they need to do to be their most sturdy, grounded, centered self. And someone might try really hard to be present and grounded and get through the interview, and something might sort of sneak up on them that they didn't anticipate. Maybe they didn't expect a question that we were going to ask, or they just are feeling more raw or vulnerable than is typical for them, and so a thing is affecting them in a deeper way. So we can watch for those signals in someone and respond to those with compassion and patience. Those basic motivational interviewing skills we talked about will help us listen well, gather the information we need, maybe even informally and organically. If someone's just given us a bunch of information in a sort of narrative while they're talking about their life, we don't need to ask them those questions again if we're just listening and taking in the information as they share it. Now, it's our job, as we said, to be really generous with our time and attention, but not to waste our clients. Maybe we think they've got nothing better to do than sit and talk to us, but I assure you that is almost never the case. So we want to try to fill out any of the parts of the forms we can before or after the direct time we're with them. We're not filling in their identity questions, and we'll talk about that soon, but we might fill in things that we already know about, things we've heard about in some other way, wait to fill out or complete some forms till after they have gone to bed or gone on with their lives or whatever. We want to use the language that a client uses to talk about homelessness, trauma, illness, disability, street life, any of those things. And we want to always, always celebrate their resilience, name and point out their strengths, and thank them. Thank them for their time, for their patience with our process, for working together with you. Because they are doing us a favor if they are putting up with our process. Now I'm going to remind us of some of the cultural competency mandates that you've heard about in Module 2. And we're just going to review a few of those quickly. The first thing we want to do is we always want to ask every client what name they want to be called and respect that. Do they want to be called Johnny or Mr. Jones or Josephine? We're not looking at their ID, we're asking them. We're not going to pre-fill questions about any demographic or identity things. We're not making assumptions about how someone identifies, their race, their ethnicity, their gender, or any of those things. So we show people the options on the form. For example, these are all the options we have for gender identity. Which one suits you best? These are all the categories for race. Which one or ones do you identify with? These are the ethnicity possibilities. I know, only 2. Weird, right? What one works best for you, right? And we're letting them choose how they are identified on our documents. We're going to use gender neutral language to refer to any relational identity terms or relationships. Never ask people any kind of private questions about their body, their medical business, their sexual or romantic or familial relationships or behaviors. Don't gossip about that with other clients or other staff, or let clients gossip about that with other clients. Don't make assumptions about who is or isn't an immigrant or what their status might be, or ask them questions about their citizenship or residency status or nationality. Use correct and respectful terms that have to do with human migration, and assure people that we will vigorously safeguard their privacy and never disclose their identity or status or even their presence in our program to anyone, and especially not to law enforcement or to ICE. We use the language a client uses to refer to their condition or difficulties, and know that sometimes people don't self-identify with any particular diagnosis or even identify a thing as a disability, even if we can observe or affirm or verify that they have some kind of diagnosable condition. Now we're going to talk quickly about how we engage with unaccompanied youth. Unaccompanied youth are young people up to their 26th birthday who do not have any parents, guardians, or caretakers traveling with them. They might be legal minors, they might be legal majors, so 18 to 25, but these folks are all considered transition age youth, unaccompanied youth, and we want to identify them quickly and treat them with great care and intentionality. And that involves admitting unaccompanied minors. Even if your program is not licensed to shelter or house unaccompanied minors, we should still bring them in, make sure they're safe, provide for their basic needs, other supports that they need, and so on, and then gauge your agency's protocol about accessing the CCBYS system. You will learn more about our recommended protocol when we talk about part 1, phase 1 of the phased assessment, because that phased assessment walks you through every step of who to call, who are you going to call, and how to do that, and has the number right on the page. But the main thing to do is not turn away someone just because they're a minor. Don't tell them they have to go to the police station. Don't tell them they have to go back home to whoever they stayed with before. Don't tell them that they have to find a CCBYS and talk to them. Let them in and use our own protocols to keep them safe and engage the CCBYS system. We should be careful not to make assumptions about whatever role parents or other adults might have in a young person's life. Whatever they're telling us, things are usually more complicated than just I ran away or I was kicked out. Almost every young person that we're going to encounter has fled some kind of violence, exploitation, or hardship, have decided that it is safer for them to take care of themselves out on the mean streets than to stay where they are. And it's important to just remember that and not assume that somebody's looking for them who wants to take care of them. We want to remember that youth are less likely to use or identify with terms such as homeless. Even if they meet every definition of homelessness that we can come up with, they might not avow that term in their lives. They often have more complicated and fluid housing and homelessness histories that include a hodgepodge, a patchwork of literal homelessness, precarious housing of various kinds, and a wide array of temporary or momentary shelter situations. So we can't just say, where have you been staying? And have only one answer to that, like we sometimes can with older people. Often young people have stayed lots of different places during the nighttime. or nowhere and just stayed on the move at nighttime, even in the course of a week. So we might ask, where are the kinds of places you have been staying or sleeping? Youth might be more comfortable being served at youth-specific agencies, so be quick to offer that option. We're not requiring that for people 18 or above, but if that's the thing they want, we've got some mechanisms in place to make that happen really quick and seamlessly. That gets spelled out in the phased assessments part 1 that we'll talk about at another time. Here's that definition of transition age youth, TAY, that we just talked about, but we'll review it again because it's really important that everyone take this in. We know that most of our agencies only house or shelter people who are 18 and above and can consent to their own shelter and care. But we all serve unaccompanied minors. We all serve transition age youth who are 18 to 25. And we're often failing to identify these transition age youth as a special population that we have special protocols and options for serving. And especially as we're moving forward in our continuum and we'll have more and more robust and creative programming to serve transition age youth, it's great that every single person in every agency everywhere become part of that team, that support net to find transition age youth and get them into the services that they need, choose, and prefer. Here's another walkthrough of that protocol for serving unaccompanied youth, people under the age of 18 who are traveling without their parents or guardians. Again, like we said, we bring them inside, we provide for their basic needs and safety, let them use the phone, take a shower, get a bite to eat, whatever it is that they need. And here's the statewide comprehensive community-based youth services hotline number. That stands for, that is, the acronym is CCBYS, Community Comprehensive Community-Based Youth Services. The hotline number is there on the screen. That's a good number for you to have in your cell phone because you never know when you're going to need it. And this happens to be in Illinois, happens to be the National Runaway Safe Line. So it's staffed 24/7 by people who are experts and engaging with young people and know what to do when someone is 14 or 16 or 17 and they're showing up without a place to stay. So that CCBYS hotline will connect you to your local CCBYS agency that serves your catchment area. And that CCBYS agency has a 24/7 crisis worker whose job it is to come to the young person and intervene appropriately. They have to come to the young person. They should not tell you to send the young person to the police station or to a DHS office or to their own CCBYS office. They are accustomed to and obligated to come to the shelter, day center, outreach location, wherever it is you've encountered this unaccompanied minor, and to intervene there. They will do an assessment which will end up with a plan for a safe place for this young person to be sheltered. They might engage the DCFS system if the young person meets that criteria of having been abused or neglected. They may provide wraparound services to secure family reunification or help and support that young person to safely return wherever it was they came from, if that's an option. They may find a youth shelter that is licensed to shelter and serve unaccompanied minors, of which we have some in our system, in our continuum, and there are others in the city of Chicago. But it's their job to work with the young person. If for some reason that local CCBYS agency is not responding appropriately, they're not coming to assess the youth, they're not coming in a timely way, then call that statewide number back and work with them for a remedy. Don't just give up, kick the young person out. If you're following this protocol, you will not get in trouble for serving that young person, letting them be in your space and get whatever services you have available for them. They can even lay down and take a nap in your shelter if you've already called the CCBYS agency and you're waiting for that crisis worker to show up, unless they've given you other viable instructions. And we're not doing this in a sort of sting operation on this young person. We want to let them know that this is what the protocol is when we cannot legally shelter or serve them where we've encountered them, and let them know that we're going to support their being agents in their own decision making all along the way. We're trying really hard in our system to capture if any young person or family has prior DCFS involvement. Maybe the young person grew up in the foster care system. Maybe this family has had children in DCFS custody, or they do currently, or they might if they don't secure safe, stable housing. Any of those things make this young person or this family potentially eligible for housing vouchers and other supports that DCFS has. If you need help accessing that, and probably you do because it's a little bit of a confusing and overwhelming and unwieldy process, then reach right out to us and we will support you in making sure that that young person or family gets whatever they need. But the first step is identifying them. Other ways that our continuum is serving young people, we have youth advisory boards in each region. We're pushing for youth advisory boards in every agency. We're working hard to identify and prioritize youth in all the ways we've just talked about. We've completed a 100-day challenge, and now we have a very generous and exciting youth homelessness demonstration programs grant. So we've just recently released the RFP for that, and agencies are now applying for new programming for homeless youth in our continuum, which is a really terrific new opportunity. Now we're going to talk about how we engage families with children. Sometimes we have the habit of thinking that the parent is our client and the little kids who are in tow are just so much distraction for us and that parent, and just sort of collateral damage, so to speak, or whatever. But it's really important that we are proactive and attentive to the needs of little kids, babies, and pregnant people who we might be encountering. We're not going to talk about this much in our current entry point basic training, but we do have a tool for you called Part 3 of the phased assessment, which is the Child and Family Needs Assessment. We won't spell that out a lot now, but it's there already as a great tool for you to think about what you can do to minimize the negative outcomes or impacts on pregnant people, little kids, and youth who are in our services. But in an immediate way, when you're starting out with assessing and beginning with a client and they have little kids with them, some of the things that we can do are including trying to provide toys, finger snacks, books, coloring, things like that to occupy little kids so that the parents can focus on the assessment process and the kids are more comfortable and happy and entertained. Potentially, have someone else volunteer to hold the baby or to play with the baby while the parent is doing the assessment, if that's a possibility, and the parent and the child are comfortable with that. But definitely have some of these things on hand. Don't expect little kids to just sit quietly indefinitely while you're asking for their parent to go through lots and lots of processes with you. We want to try to avoid discussing topics in front of kids that could be distressing or confusing for them or their parent, because we want to try to preserve the parent's role of being confident and on top of things. So try not to talk about anything, even with a tiny baby, that's going to make that parent upset. because that will result in, potential harm or trauma to the little kid. And especially as kids are old enough to pay attention, be really careful as you talk about the crisis or things that make their parent feel less than capable, or, that might make that child be distressed about their current circumstances or their future. It's never too early to ask about, to start planning for the needs of pregnant people, babies, and children, and ensure that they're all connected with age-appropriate services and supports. There are all kinds of resources available: emergency childcare, early intervention services, all kinds of things that help remedy the impact that crisis has on little kids and their development, and help that parent be able to focus on the housing crisis and things like that. We all want to be aware of our mandated reporter obligations and be honest and non-judgmental with clients about those if they arise. I'm sure your agency has protocols about that, so follow those protocols. Now, all of us are encountering survivors of DV or sexual assault or human trafficking. Some of the things we want to do to make sure to make safe space as we're engaging with them are, first of all, ensure that they feel safe at this point in time, at this location. We need to immediately make arrangements to safely transfer people to another location if needed. We'll talk more about that, how that goes, in a minute. We want to help them consider the wide array of supports that might be available, including calling hotlines and accessing supports through a DV agency or a sexual assault agency or a trafficking agency. And all that info is there for you, easy to access on part 1, the safety screening, which we'll talk about at a different time. It's really important that we affirm the client's courage and resilience, whether or not they have resolved to permanently stay away from their abuser or to prevent that abuse in the future in ways that you might be able to detail for them. We want to take a minute to think about VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, that provides various protections for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, as well as to anyone who's affiliated with that victim, their children, and so on. VAWA protections are not limited only to women, even though it's called the Violence Against Women Act, but they're available equally to anybody of any gender, any sex, any sexual orientation, any gender identity, or relationship status with someone who is facing violence, especially by someone that they live with or who is very familiar to them. VAWA protections provide that a program cannot discriminate against someone on the basis of their being a survivor of violence if they're otherwise eligible for services. So participants can't be denied or terminated from housing services just because they are survivors of domestic violence, trafficking, or sexual assault. And in fact, COC-funded providers are among those responsible for implementing these VAWA protections. And we have very comprehensive, thoughtful ways that we work as a region to take care of survivors of violence. Some of the ways that we work to serve survivors is that we have a mandatory DV 101 training. There's another one of those on the schedule soon. If you haven't had that, get it done. It's part of our entry point basic training. We are working hard to identify as soon as we can who might be fleeing domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, or trafficking. And we have part 1, the safety screen, to help us do that right away when we first start talking to someone. We do robust safety planning. We have DV liaisons in our system, people who are experts and who are helping build bridges between the DV specialty agencies and all the rest of our agencies. We have various wraparound supports that are especially provided by those DV specialty agencies, and people who are fleeing domestic violence, especially those in sexual assault and trafficking, especially those who are at imminent risk of serious harm, are prioritized for housing in our system based on the DV prioritization tool, which is in use and in development and in refinement right now. And the DV liaisons are the experts and the ones who will implement that tool at this stage. So reach out to those. If you don't know who the DV liaison for your agency is, reach out to us, Jessica or Amber or any of us, and we will help make sure to build that bridge for you. So just to fill in the gaps of what we've been talking about, if a client does not feel safe at the current shelter or service location, then it's our job to arrange a safe transfer to a DV specialty agency. Most of those are at undisclosed, unpublished locations that are safer and where it's less likely that a stalker or abuser would be able to find them. How we execute a safe transfer is you can work directly with your DV liaison, let them know that you have someone who's fleeing and needs immediate transfer, or you can call one of the DV hotlines or one of the local DV agencies. All of these numbers are right there for you in part one, the safety screening. When you call a DV hotline or a DV agency, the worker will ask to speak privately with the client to ascertain that they do not feel safe to return home that night, or that they don't have a safe home to return to. The DV agency may be able to arrange transportation for this client from your unsafe location to their location. If they are not able to do that, then it is our job as a sending agency to do that, to put somebody in a cab or an Uber and get them where they're safe. If you're not sure how to do that, talk to folks at your agency about how your agency fulfills this safe transfer mandate. Now, if you're working for a housing agency and you're working with people who are already housed in your program and they experience domestic violence or sexual assault, then there is a provision for emergency transfer for them. This means that survivors can move to another safe and available unit within your program if they face imminent threat of harm by remaining in their current unit. If they cannot stay safely in the area where your agency serves people for housing, then you work with the CE team, the entry point team, to prioritize that client for the next available opening in a safer area with a different program. So you first try to rehouse someone quickly within your own agency if that is their choice and is safe and appropriate for them. If they feel that they cannot stay in that agency or in that area and you need help from another agency, then use the entry point team to make that happen. Just a few more things to talk about now. We've been talking about how we do assessment, and particularly how we work with special populations, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a view now of how our phased assessment process works. So we start with safety screening, which is part one, and I've been talking about that a lot in this module. There's a separate module coming up tomorrow on part one on the safety screening part. There's a whole module for that. So tune in for that. Or, whenever you can do that if you're listening to this as a recording. So that's step one. The second step is the initial intake, which our programs do. Then there are the other steps that you see on the page there that are all parts of the phased assessment, which we'll be talking about in various ways over the rest of. So I don't think you can hear I think you can hear the recorded voice that's on these slides, so I'm going to narrate it for us. And I apologize for that. So part one is the safety screening, and we do that at the same time as the entry point we do the entry point safety screening at the same time as the HMIS initial intake or your program intake. We do that right away at the same time. The next step is for the special populations listed on your screen, we move as quickly as possible to part 4, the VI SPDAT and vulnerability assessment. So if your client is part of a chronically homeless household, if they're a veteran, if they're a transition age youth, if they're a household that has minor children in it, then you're going to start this part 4 right away. Then immediately for those groups, begin gathering eligibility documentation, which includes all of the things in part 5 that we will go over again later on. And if for some reason a client presents any of the challenges on the page here, we have workarounds for all those things. So maybe you have a client who doesn't want to participate in the assessment, or they're unable to focus or complete the assessment because their mental status is too fragile, because they just don't have the bandwidth to pay attention, because they can't remember the answers to things about their homelessness history or other things like that. Maybe they underrepresent their vulnerability. They tell you they don't have any disabilities or any challenges, but you can observe that they do have some of these obstacles, some of these vulnerabilities, maybe even disabilities. Maybe they overrepresent their vulnerability because they're accustomed to just saying yes to every question. All of those are things that we'll talk more about when we talk about part 4 of the phased assessment, solutions that we have built into our process. If there are people who don't want to have their information shared, that's another thing to problem solve with the entry point lead team. We have monthly Zero meetings and weekly case consultation conversations led by the entry point lead team. And those are great opportunities to ask for help if you've got any of these obstacles and need some help coming up with solutions. That brings us to the end of module 4 for assessment, and you can now complete your post-test and evaluation for this module to round out this module.